Theophilus Richardson was captured near Petersburg while assisting a comrade whose horse had fallen, fracturing his collarbone. This occurred in January of 1864. Theo escaped the enemy and waded across the river at Moorefield, West Virginia, but was recaptured. He was sent to Belle Isle and then Andersonville. He survived the explosion. He spent 3 hours in the freezing water, and he died in 1873. A pension for his 5 children was approved at a rate of $8 per month. Now, the average salary was $1 a day, so 5 children, $8 a month. Didn't go far. George Smith was a machinist with Hobbs Taylor Company in Wheeling, and then trained as a steamboat engineer on the boat Ben Franklin. He lived with his sister's family prior to enlisting in Carlin's Battery. He signed up for a 3-month enrollment and drove wagons of supplies from Webster to troops in Beverly, Virginia. He suffered a fractured skull when hit by flying debris during the boiler explosion on the Sultana, and he was in the water for 5 hours before being rescued. George was granted a pension and lived until 1912. Alan Stevens was employed by the Composition Roofing Company of Wheeling before joining up for a 3-month stint at the age of 19. When his 3 months were up, he enrolled in Carlin's Battery. Taken prisoner at Winchester, he was paroled and hospitalized off and on for the next year after being shot in the foot. Doesn't say who shot him. Maybe he shot himself, maybe it was the enemy, maybe he had somebody do it for him, who knows. He was again captured in 1864 and taken to Andersonville. He did not survive the Sultana Disaster. Zachary Taylor Woodyard was only 16 when he joined the Army, and he was captured only 4 days later. Can you imagine? You're 16 years old, you join the Army, 4 days later you're a prisoner. He was a prisoner at Libby Prison, which is one of the worst, in Richmond, Belle Isle, and finally Andersonville, where he contracted scurvy, rheumatism, and catarrh. Catarrh, I think, is their name for pneumonia. He was given a job in the cookhouse at the prison, which probably saved his life. He survived the explosion and went on to testify in the trial of James Duncan, a Confederate who had given him a job in the cookhouse. Now, let me say, although not on the Sultana, one of the most interesting stories of all is that of James Duncan, who had been a baker in Wheeling before moving to Louisiana, where he enlisted in the 5th Louisiana Infantry. Duncan was appointed to be the baker for the Andersonville prison. Bakery was located outside the stockade. He searched out and found many prisoners from Wheeling. He gave them work in the bakery plus extra rations. After the war, he was accused of murdering a prisoner, feeding rations to his hogs, and stealing packages from home intended for the prisoners. The trial took place in Savannah, Georgia in 1866, and 5 ex-prisoners from Wheeling went to testify on his behalf. The identity of the murdered man was never found, yet Duncan was found guilty of most of the charges and sentenced to 15 years hard labor at Fort Pulaski. Now, first of all, he didn't have any hogs. They never figured out who this guy he was supposed to have murdered was. And I've been to Fort Pulaski. It's a very interesting fort. It's got a moat with alligators in it. Obviously, the judge was prejudiced against a northerner who had aided and abetted the prisoners from his hometown. 16 people, including Daniel Lamb, one of Wheeling's prominent men, signed a petition to President Andrew Johnson asking for the release of Duncan, to no avail. Duncan himself wrote to the president stating that his family, wife, mother-in-law, and 4 children were suffering intense hardship without his support. Again, his pleas went unanswered. On July 11, 1867, Duncan escaped the prison with the help of former prisoners that he had befriended, and he moved to Philadelphia with his family. I think he couldn't come back here to Wheeling because he would have been rearrested. A government investigation of the explosion exonerated Captain Speed and all others except Hatch, who refused to testify and was blamed but never charged. Survivors of the Sultana met regularly at reunions in Ohio. and there's a monument to the Ohio men in Mansfield, Ohio. Some may dispute that the Sultana was the worst maritime disaster in history and ask about the Titanic. There were a few similarities in the two disasters. The Titanic hit the iceberg at 2:20 a.m. and the boilers blew on the Sultana at 2 a.m. But Titanic was a much larger boat, 882 feet long, compared to 260 feet of the Sultana. The Titanic carried the rich and famous of the world, whereas the Sultana carried destitute soldiers, weakened and exhausted from their ordeal in prison. Both vessels carried about the same number of passengers. The Sultana between 2,250 and 2,300, and the Titanic at 2,223. A rescue vessel saved 706 people from the Titanic, while 786 were saved from the Sultana. More than 200 people from the Sultana died after the rescue, which resulted in the percentage of dead approaching 75%, compared with the 68% who died as a result of the Titanic disaster. Since most of the victims of the tragedy were from the Midwest and the newspapers were mostly in the East, the story of the Sultana was generally ignored. Thus ends the tale of America's worst maritime disaster and one of the saddest chapters in history.